The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the Afghan mountainside as Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison adjusted his scope for the third time in 10 minutes. Something was wrong with his rifle, and in his line of work, equipment failure meant death. The M40A1 sniper rifle had been his faithful companion through 2 deployments, but today it was acting like a temperamental child. Morrison wiped the sweat from his brow and examined the weapon more carefully. The stock felt different somehow, heavier than usual. As he ran his calloused fingers along the wooden surface, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There, carved deep into the grain of the wood, was a single word that hadn't been there yesterday. Deathwind. His spotter, Corporal Williams, noticed Morrison's sudden stillness. "What's got you spooked, Sarge?" Williams asked, lowering his binoculars. Morrison showed him the carving, and Williams whistled low under his breath. "That wasn't there during morning inspection, was it?" Morrison shook his head slowly. He had cleaned and inspected this rifle personally every day for the past 8 months. He knew every scratch, every worn spot, every imperfection in the metal and wood. This carving was new, and that was impossible. The rifle had been locked in the armory all night, and only Morrison had the access code. The 2 Marines were positioned on a rocky outcrop overlooking a valley where intelligence suggested Taliban fighters were moving weapons through a network of caves. Their mission was simple: observe and report. But nothing about this deployment had been simple so far. Strange things had been happening ever since their unit arrived at Forward Operating Base Chapman 3 weeks ago. Equipment would go missing and then reappear in impossible places. Soldiers reported hearing voices in empty bunkers. Most disturbing of all, their previous sniper team had vanished without a trace during what should have been a routine reconnaissance mission. Only their rifles were found, abandoned on a hilltop with no sign of struggle or explanation. Morrison tried to focus on the mission, but the carved word seemed to burn into his consciousness. Deathwind. What did it mean? Who had carved it? And why did the name fill him with such inexplicable dread? As the hours passed, Morrison found himself studying the carving more intently. The letters were perfectly formed, carved with surgical precision. This wasn't the work of someone using a field knife in a hurry. This was craftsmanship, deliberate and careful. The depth of the cut suggested they had been made over time, possibly years. Williams kept glancing at his partner nervously. Morrison was one of the steadiest snipers in the Corps, but today he seemed distracted, almost haunted. "Maybe we should report back to base," Williams suggested. "Get that rifle checked out by the armorers." Morrison was about to agree when movement in the valley below caught his attention. Through his scope, he could see figures moving between the rocks carrying what appeared to be crates of ammunition. This was exactly what they had been sent to observe. He pushed thoughts of the mysterious carving aside and focused on his training. But as he settled into firing position, something extraordinary happened. The rifle, which had been malfunctioning all morning, suddenly felt perfect in his hands. The scope was crystal clear, the trigger smooth as silk. It was as if the weapon had come alive, eager to fulfill its deadly purpose. Morrison took careful aim at the lead figure in the valley. The distance was nearly 800 meters, a challenging shot even under perfect conditions. But as his finger found the trigger, he felt a strange sense of confidence, as if someone else was guiding his movements. The shot rang out across the valley, echoing off the mountainsides. Through his scope, Morrison watched his target drop instantly, but instead of feeling satisfaction at a successful shot, he felt a chill run down his spine. The rifle seemed to pulse with energy, as if it had been feeding on the violence. Williams was calling in the successful engagement to base when Morrison noticed something that made his hands tremble. The carving on the stock had changed. Below the word Deathwind, a small tally mark had appeared, carved in the same precise style as the name. Morrison stared at the mark, his mind racing. Either he was losing his sanity, or this rifle was somehow keeping score. And if that was true, then how many marks had been there before? How many lives had this weapon claimed? As they prepared to move to their extraction point, Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that he had just become part of something much larger and more dangerous than a simple reconnaissance mission. The rifle felt heavier now, weighted down not just with wood and metal, but with history and purpose that he was only beginning to understand. Back at Forward Operating Base Chapman, Morrison sat alone in his quarters staring at the M40A1 propped against the wall. The other Marines were in the mess hall, but he had no appetite. The mysterious tally mark haunted his thoughts, and he needed answers. He decided to visit Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the base's senior armorer. Rodriguez had been in the Corps for 22 years and had seen more weapons than anyone Morrison knew. If anyone could explain what was happening with the rifle, it would be him. Morrison found Rodriguez in the armory, methodically cleaning an M249 machine gun. The older Marine looked up as Morrison entered, immediately noticing the troubled expression on the younger man's face. "What's eating at you, Morrison?" Rodriguez asked, setting down his cleaning rod. Morrison hesitated for a moment, then brought out the M40A1 and placed it on the workbench. Rodriguez examined the rifle with professional interest, running his experienced hands over the metal and wood. When his fingers found the carving, he stopped cold. His face went pale and he stepped back from the weapon as if it had suddenly caught fire. "Where did you get this?" Rodriguez demanded, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. Morrison explained about finding the carving and the mysterious appearance of the tally mark after his successful shot. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, then walked to a locked cabinet and pulled out a thick, weathered logbook. He flipped through pages covered with serial numbers, maintenance records, and weapon assignments. Finally, he found what he was looking for. "This rifle," Rodriguez said slowly, "has been listed as missing for 3 years. According to these records, it disappeared along with Marine sniper Patrick O'Sullivan during Operation Desert Strike in Iraq." Morrison felt his stomach drop. "Missing? But I've been carrying it for 8 months. It was assigned to me when I arrived in country." Rodriguez shook his head grimly. "That's impossible. This weapon was never officially recovered. O'Sullivan was found dead in a bombed-out building in Fallujah, but his rifle was gone. The investigation concluded that insurgents had taken it." The two Marines stared at the weapon in silence. Morrison's mind was reeling with questions. If the rifle had been missing for 3 years, how had it ended up in the armory? Who had assigned it to him? And most importantly, what had happened during those missing years? Rodriguez continued reading from the logbook, his frown deepening. "There's more. O'Sullivan wasn't the original owner of this rifle. Before him, it was carried by Sergeant Maria Santos during her deployment to Afghanistan in 2004. She also died under mysterious circumstances, and the rifle went missing then too." Morrison felt a chill run through him. "How many previous owners?" Rodriguez flipped back through more pages, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "At least 5 that I can document. Maybe more. Each time the sniper dies or disappears and the rifle vanishes. Then it shows up months or years later, somehow finding its way back into official channels." The armorer closed the logbook and looked directly at Morrison. "There are stories about this weapon, son. Stories that most people would call superstition or battlefield stress. But I've been around long enough to know that some things can't be explained by regulations and procedures." Morrison leaned forward eagerly. "What kind of stories?" Rodriguez glanced around nervously, then lowered his voice. "They say this rifle was originally carried by a Marine sniper named Michael Chen during the Vietnam War. Chen was known for his incredible accuracy and his ability to make impossible shots. His fellow Marines nicknamed him Deathwind because of how quietly and efficiently he could eliminate targets." The story continued to unfold as Rodriguez spoke. Chen had customized his rifle extensively, carving his nickname into the stock and keeping a personal tally of confirmed kills. He became legendary among Marine snipers, credited with over 300 confirmed kills during his tour. But something changed during Chen's final months in Vietnam. Other Marines reported that he had become obsessed with his rifle, talking to it like it was alive. He claimed it whispered to him, guiding his shots and choosing his targets. Command attributed this to combat stress, but Chen's accuracy remained superhuman until the day he died. Chen was killed by a sniper's bullet to the head during the Battle of Hue City, Rodriguez continued. But witnesses said something strange happened when he died. They claimed the rifle glowed with a faint light for several seconds, as if Chen's spirit was somehow being absorbed into the weapon. Morrison felt goosebumps rise on his arms. "And you think that spirit is still in there?" Rodriguez shrugged uncomfortably. "I think there are things in this world that military training doesn't prepare you for. What I can tell you is that every Marine who has carried this rifle has died violently, and each one reported the same things you're experiencing now. The weapon seems to have a will of its own." As if responding to their conversation, the rifle seemed to shift slightly on the workbench. Both Marines froze, staring at the weapon. Morrison could swear he saw the wood grain pattern move like waves on a dark ocean. Rodriguez stepped back further. "Morrison, I'm going to give you some advice. Turn in that rifle. Request a different weapon. Get as far away from it as you can." But even as Rodriguez spoke, Morrison felt a strange reluctance to give up the M40A1. Despite the mysterious and frightening circumstances, he couldn't deny that the rifle had performed flawlessly during the mission. The shot he had made in the valley was one of the best of his career. Maybe, he thought, he could control whatever force was within the weapon. Morrison picked up the rifle, feeling its familiar weight in his hands. "I can't, Master Sergeant. My unit is heading out on another mission tomorrow. I need a weapon I can trust." Rodriguez looked at him with a mixture of pity and fear. "Son, that rifle may be trustworthy, but the question is, can it trust you? Or will you end up like all the others?" That night, Morrison couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the tally mark on the rifle stock growing longer, adding more lines with each shot he might take. He had placed the M40A1 in his wall locker, but he could feel its presence like a weight in the room. At 0200 hours, he gave up on sleep and decided to do some research. The base had a small library with military history books and access to some archived records. If Rodriguez was right about the rifle's history, there might be more information available. Morrison spent hours reading through Vietnam War records, searching for any mention of Michael Chen or the nickname Deathwind. What he found was both fascinating and terrifying. Chen had indeed been a legendary Marine sniper, but the official records painted a different picture than the stories Rodriguez had told. According to military documents, Chen's kill count had been impressive but not supernatural. What was unusual was the number of incident reports filed about his behavior during his final months of service. Fellow Marines had reported that Chen talked to his rifle during quiet moments, carrying on one-sided conversations as if someone was responding. He had become increasingly isolated from his unit, preferring to work alone rather than with a spotter. Most disturbing were reports that Chen sometimes knew about enemy movements before they were officially reported, as if he had advance intelligence that he shared with no one. The final report was the most chilling. On the day Chen died, his spotter, Corporal James Martinez, had filed a statement claiming that Chen had known about the enemy sniper before the attack began. Martinez reported that Chen had said, "She's calling me home," just moments before the fatal shot rang out. Morrison felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. She's calling me home. Who was she? And why did that phrase fill him with such dread? As he continued reading, Morrison discovered that Martinez had survived the war and eventually written a book about his experiences as a spotter. The book, titled Eyes in the Darkness, contained a chapter specifically about Chen and the mysterious rifle. According to Martinez's account, the rifle had been custom-built by a Vietnamese gunsmith named Linh Nguyen, who had been captured and forced to work for American forces. Nguyen claimed that she had infused the weapon with the spirit of her dead son, a North Vietnamese soldier who had been killed by American snipers. The gunsmith had supposedly told Chen that the rifle would make him the greatest sniper in the war, but at a terrible price. Each kill would bind him more closely to the weapon, and eventually, the rifle would claim his soul as payment. Chen had dismissed this as superstition, but as his kill count grew, he began to experience strange phenomena. He reported hearing whispers during quiet moments, seeing shadows that shouldn't exist, and most unsettling of all, having dreams where he saw through the rifle's scope even when he wasn't carrying it. Morrison closed the book, his hands trembling slightly. The parallels to his own experience were too obvious to ignore. He thought about the strange confidence he had felt during yesterday's shot, the way the rifle had seemed to guide his movements. As he sat in the quiet library, Morrison became aware of a faint sound coming from the direction of his quarters. It was barely audible, like whispered words carried on the wind. He tried to convince himself it was just the ventilation system or other Marines moving through the building, but deep down he knew better. The sound was coming from his wall locker, where the M40A1 waited in the darkness. Morrison made his way back to his quarters, moving as quietly as possible to avoid waking his sleeping roommates. The whispering sound grew stronger as he approached his locker, and he could swear he heard actual words being spoken in a voice that was neither male nor female. With shaking hands, he opened the locker, The rifle lay exactly where he had left it, but the wood seemed to gleam with an inner light. The carving reading Deathwind appeared deeper and more pronounced than before, as if it had been freshly cut. As Morrison stared at the weapon, the whispering stopped, replaced by a profound silence that seemed to press against his eardrums. Then, clear as if someone was standing next to him, he heard a woman's voice speak a single word: "Ready." Morrison stumbled backward, bumping into his roommate's bunk. Corporal Williams stirred in his sleep but didn't wake. Morrison looked back at the locker, but the rifle appeared normal again, just wood and metal in the dim light. But the damage was done. Morrison now knew that whatever force inhabited the weapon was aware of him, communicating with him. The question was whether he was strong enough to resist its influence, or if he would end up like Michael Chen and all the others who had carried the cursed rifle. As he finally drifted off to sleep near dawn, Morrison made a decision. Tomorrow's mission would be different. He would test the limits of the rifle's power, but on his terms. He would master the weapon before it could master him. It was a decision that would prove to be either his salvation or his doom, but Morrison was too tired and too proud to consider the possibility that he might not be as strong as he believed. The rifle, meanwhile, waited patiently in its locker, counting the hours until it would taste blood again. In the darkness, almost imperceptible to human eyes, another tally mark appeared on the stock. Not for a kill that had already happened, but for one that was yet to come. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Morrison's unit had been reassigned to a high-priority mission based on intelligence gathered from the previous day's reconnaissance. A high-value Taliban commander had been spotted moving through the mountains with a small convoy, and Morrison's team was tasked with eliminating him. As Morrison prepared for the mission, he noticed something unsettling about the M40A1. The rifle seemed lighter than usual, as if it was eager to be carried. When he performed his routine inspection, every component was in perfect condition, better than it had ever been. The scope was crystal clear, the trigger mechanism smooth as silk, and the barrel showed no signs of wear despite months of use. Williams joined him at the equipment check, but stopped short when he saw Morrison handling the rifle. "Sarge, there's something different about that weapon today. It looks, I don't know, newer somehow." Morrison nodded grimly. He had noticed the same thing. It was as if the rifle was preparing itself for something important, drawing energy from some unknown source to enhance its capabilities. The mission briefing revealed that the target would be moving through a narrow mountain pass approximately 1,200 meters from their intended position. It would be an extremely challenging shot, requiring precise calculation of wind speed, elevation, and bullet drop. Under normal circumstances, Morrison would have requested backup from other snipers, but something told him that wouldn't be necessary. As the team moved out toward their position, Morrison found himself thinking about Michael Chen and the other Marines who had carried this rifle. Had they experienced the same strange confidence he was feeling? Had they also believed they could control the weapon's power? The hike to the observation point took 3 hours through rough terrain. Morrison's team consisted of himself, Williams as his spotter, and 2 other Marines providing security. As they established their position on a rocky outcrop overlooking the mountain pass, Morrison felt the familiar weight of the rifle settling into his hands. Williams set up his spotting scope and began scanning the area below. "No movement yet, but intelligence says they should be coming through within the hour," he reported. Morrison settled into a comfortable firing position and began his pre-shot routine. But as he looked through the scope, something extraordinary happened. The view was not just magnified, but somehow enhanced, as if he could see details that should have been impossible at this range. Through the scope, Morrison could make out individual rocks and small plants in the valley below with startling clarity. More unsettling still, he began to see things that weren't there yet but would be. Shadows of movement that suggested where the enemy convoy would appear. Ghostly outlines of targets he had not yet acquired. "Williams," Morrison called quietly. "Do you see anything moving in the pass?" His spotter adjusted his scope and scanned the area carefully. "Negative. Nothing but rocks and empty ground." But Morrison continued to see the phantom movements as if the rifle was showing him the future. He found himself adjusting his position to compensate for shots he hadn't taken yet, calculating angles for targets that existed only in his enhanced vision. Then, exactly where the ghostly images had suggested, the real convoy appeared. 5 men moving in single file through the narrow pass, the target clearly identifiable by his distinctive clothing and the deference shown by his companions. Williams confirmed the sighting and began calling out range and wind readings, but Morrison found he already knew all the information. The rifle seemed to be feeding him data directly, calculating the complex ballistics automatically. Range 1,230 meters. Wind from the northwest at 8 knots, temperature 72 degrees, Williams reported. Morrison made his adjustments, but he could feel the rifle guiding his movements, correcting his aim with subtle nudges that felt like gentle suggestions from a trusted friend. As he settled his crosshairs on the target, time seemed to slow down. In that extended moment, Morrison heard the woman's voice again, clearer than before. "This one matters," she whispered. "This one will feed us both." Morrison tried to push the voice aside and focus on his training, but the rifle seemed to pulse with anticipation. Through his scope, he could see not just the target but somehow new intimate details about the man's life, his family, his fears. It was as if the rifle was showing him the target's soul, making the kill more personal and satisfying. The shot, when it came, was perfect. Morrison felt the rifle recoil smoothly against his shoulder, but the sensation was different from any shot he had taken before. It felt like a release of pent-up energy, as if both he and the weapon had been building toward this moment. Through his scope, Morrison watched the target drop instantly, but instead of satisfaction, he felt a strange emptiness, as if something vital had been drained from him. The rifle, meanwhile, seemed to vibrate with contentment, like a cat purring after a successful hunt. Williams confirmed the kill and began calling it into base, but Morrison barely heard him. He was staring at the stock of the rifle, watching in fascination and horror as a new tally mark carved itself into the wood before his eyes. The mark was deeper and more elaborate than the previous one, as if this kill had been somehow more significant. But that wasn't what made Morrison's blood run cold. Below the new tally mark, carved in the same precise lettering as Deathwind, a new word had appeared. Soon. Morrison tried to convince himself that he was hallucinating from stress and exhaustion, but he could feel the rifle's satisfaction like a physical presence. Whatever force inhabited the weapon had been fed, and it was growing stronger. As the team prepared to move to their extraction point, Morrison made a disturbing discovery. The phantom visions hadn't stopped with the successful mission. Through his scope, he could see more ghostly movements in distant locations, more future targets that the rifle wanted him to engage. The weapon wasn't satisfied with one kill. It wanted more, and Morrison realized with growing horror that his appetite for violence was growing along with it. The empty feeling inside him could only be filled with more shots, more targets, more death. For the first time since he had discovered the carved name, Morrison truly understood the danger he was in. The rifle wasn't just influencing his accuracy, it was changing his very nature, turning him into something that craved killing as much as breathing. But even with this knowledge, Morrison found he couldn't bear the thought of giving up the weapon. The power it offered was intoxicating, and the mission's success would certainly advance his career. Perhaps, he told himself, he could find a way to use the rifle's abilities without losing himself completely. It was a rationalization that every previous owner had probably made, and Morrison was too deep under the weapon's influence to recognize the parallel. 3 weeks after the successful elimination of the Taliban commander, Morrison had become the most requested sniper on the base. His accuracy rating was unprecedented, and his mission success rate was 100%. Command had recommended him for promotion and commendation, but Morrison barely registered the praise. All he could think about was the next mission, the next target, the next opportunity to feed the growing hunger inside him. The rifle had become an extension of his body, and he found himself carrying it even when off duty, unable to bear being separated from the weapon for more than a few hours. Williams had noticed the change in his partner and was growing increasingly concerned. Morrison had lost weight, slept fitfully, and spoke in clipped militaristic sentences even during casual conversation. Most disturbing of all, Morrison had begun talking to the rifle during quiet moments, just as the reports had described Michael Chen doing decades earlier. "Sarge, you need to talk to someone," Williams said one evening as they cleaned their equipment after another successful mission. "Maybe see the chaplain or the medic. This isn't healthy." Morrison looked up from polishing the M40A1, his eyes cold and distant. I'm performing better than I ever have. My kill count is the highest in the company. What's unhealthy about success? Williams gestured toward the rifle. You're obsessed with that weapon. You act like it's alive or something. And the way you've been making those impossible shots? It's not natural, Morrison. For a moment, anger flashed in Morrison's eyes, and Williams stepped back involuntarily. Then Morrison seemed to regain control of himself, but his smile was strained and didn't reach his eyes. The rifle and I understand each other, Morrison said quietly. We're partners. She tells me what I need to know, and I give her what she needs. She? Williams stared at his friend in alarm. Morrison, you're talking about a piece of equipment like it's a person. That's not normal. But Morrison had already turned back to polishing the rifle, running his cloth along the stock with gentle, almost loving strokes. As he worked, Williams could swear he heard his partner humming softly under his breath. A tune that sounded vaguely Asian but unlike anything he had ever heard before. That night, Williams made a decision that would save his life. He requested an immediate transfer to another unit, citing personality conflicts with his current spotter team. The request was approved within 48 hours, and Williams left Forward Operating Base Chapman without saying goodbye to Morrison. Morrison barely noticed his partner's departure. The rifle had been showing him new visions, more complex scenarios that would require him to work alone. He had been dreaming about a massive operation, something that would establish his reputation forever and satisfy the weapon's growing appetite. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Intelligence had located a major insurgent meeting in a compound 30 miles from the base. Multiple high-value targets would be present, including several commanders who had been evading capture for months. The mission would require a single sniper to eliminate as many targets as possible before the insurgents could scatter. Morrison volunteered for the solo assignment, claiming his recent success record qualified him for such a demanding operation. Command was reluctant to send one sniper against so many targets, but Morrison's performance had been so exceptional that they agreed to let him try. As Morrison prepared for what would be the largest single sniper operation of his career, he felt the rifle's excitement building. The weapon seemed to vibrate with anticipation, and the carved words on the stock had grown more elaborate. Now reading, Deathwind soon feeds many. The mission required Morrison to hike alone to a position overlooking the compound, establish a hide site, and wait for the meeting to begin. As he moved through the darkness toward his destination, Morrison felt more alive than he had since childhood. The rifle on his back seemed weightless, and he moved with supernatural stealth and confidence. He established his position just before dawn, settling into a natural depression in the rocks that provided perfect concealment while offering clear lines of sight to the compound below. Through his scope, Morrison could see guards moving around the perimeter and figures gathering inside the main building. But as the sun rose higher, Morrison began to see things that troubled even his increasingly warped perception. Through the rifle's scope, he could see not just the insurgent leaders but also women and children in the compound. Some appeared to be family members. Others might have been hostages or servants. The woman's voice in his head whispered urgently, "Take them all. Feed me completely." For the first time in weeks, Morrison hesitated. His training and moral code, though heavily eroded by the rifle's influence, still contained some limits. He could justify killing enemy combatants, but innocent civilians were another matter entirely. "No," he whispered to the rifle. "Not the children." The response was immediate and terrifying. Pain shot through Morrison's head like lightning, and the rifle seemed to grow heavy in his hands. Through his scope, the images became distorted and confusing, making it impossible to distinguish between legitimate targets and civilians. "You will take them all," the woman's voice commanded, "or you will take nothing." Morrison struggled against the weapon's will, but he could feel his resistance weakening with each passing moment. The pain in his head intensified, and he began to understand that the rifle would not allow him to refuse its demands. As he wrestled with the terrible choice before him, Morrison caught sight of movement in his peripheral vision. Someone was approaching his position from behind, moving with military precision and stealth. He turned to see a figure in desert camouflage crawling toward him across the rocky ground. The newcomer was a Navy SEAL, distinguished by his equipment and the calm professionalism of his movements. As the SEAL drew closer, Morrison could see that he was carrying an M40A1 sniper rifle nearly identical to his own. The SEAL settled into position beside Morrison and spoke quietly without taking his eyes off the compound below. "Staff Sergeant Morrison, I'm Chief Petty Officer David Chen. I believe you have something that belongs to my family." Morrison stared at the SEAL in shock. "Chen, are you related to—" "Michael Chen was my grandfather," the SEAL replied grimly. "And that rifle you're carrying has been hunting my family for 3 generations. It's time to end this." Chief Petty Officer David Chen moved with the quiet confidence of a seasoned operator as he positioned himself next to Morrison. His own rifle was clearly a custom M40A1, but instead of the malevolent energy that radiated from Morrison's weapon, Chen's rifle seemed to emanate calm purpose. "Your grandfather," Morrison managed to say, fighting against the pain that continued to pulse through his skull. "I read about him." "The rifle? It's been whispering to me," Chen nodded grimly. "My family has been tracking that cursed weapon for 30 years. Every time it surfaces, someone dies and then it disappears again. My grandfather was the first, but not the last." Through gritted teeth, Morrison asked, "How did you find me?" "The same way the rifle finds its victims," Chen explained, never taking his eyes off the compound. "There are patterns, signatures that those who know what to look for can recognize. Impossible shots, behavioral changes, reports of snipers talking to their weapons. When your success rate started breaking records, it triggered alerts we've had in place for years." The woman's voice in Morrison's head grew more insistent, demanding that he ignore the newcomer and complete his mission. The pain intensified, making it difficult for Morrison to think clearly. But Chen's presence seemed to provide some kind of shield, weakening the rifle's hold over him. "The weapon wants me to kill everyone in that compound," Morrison confessed, "including the civilians. I won't do it." Chen studied Morrison carefully, recognizing the internal struggle that had consumed his grandfather decades earlier. "The rifle feeds on death and violence, but it needs a willing host. The more you fight it, the weaker its hold becomes. But if you give in completely, I become like your grandfather," Morrison finished. "Worse," Chen corrected. "Each host makes it stronger. By the time it claimed my grandfather, it had only consumed 2 previous snipers. You would be number 7 or 8. The weapon's appetite has grown with each feeding." In the compound below, more figures were gathering for what appeared to be an important meeting. Through his scope, Morrison could see clearly defined military-age males carrying weapons along with several women and at least 3 children. The rifle urged him to take the shots, to feed its hunger with indiscriminate violence. But Chen's presence continued to create a buffer against the weapon's influence. For the first time in weeks, Morrison could think clearly enough to understand the full horror of what he had become. "How do I stop it?" Morrison asked desperately. Chen reached into his pack and pulled out an object that made Morrison's blood run cold. It was a wooden rifle stock, carved with intricate designs and covered with tally marks. But this stock was blackened and burned as if it had been through a fire. "This belonged to the original rifle," Chen explained. "The one my grandfather carried in Vietnam. After he died, the weapon somehow transferred its essence to replacement stocks, creating copies of itself. But the original stock contains the key to destroying the curse." Morrison stared at the burned wood. "What happened to it?" "My father happened to it," Chen replied with grim satisfaction. "James Chen, Michael's son. He tracked down the rifle after the war and found a way to separate the spirit from the weapon. But the curse was too strong to be completely destroyed, so it found new hosts, new rifles to inhabit." The pain in Morrison's head suddenly spiked to unbearable levels as the rifle sensed the threat posed by the burned stock. Through his scope, the images became completely distorted, showing him nightmare visions of death and destruction. "It's fighting back," Morrison gasped. "I can't. It hurts too much." Chen acted quickly, pressing the burned stock against Morrison's rifle. The moment the 2 pieces of wood touched, there was a flash of light and a sound like screaming wind. Morrison felt something being torn away from his consciousness, leaving him gasping and disoriented but clear-headed for the first time in months. The M40A1 in his hand suddenly felt like nothing more than metal and wood, devoid of the malevolent presence that had consumed his thoughts for months. The carved words on the stock began to fade, becoming lighter and less distinct with each passing second. But the victory was temporary. Even as the immediate threat receded, Chen could see new carvings beginning to appear on his own rifle stock. The curse was attempting to jump to a new host, seeking another weapon to inhabit. "It's trying to transfer to your rifle," Morrison warned, his voice hoarse from the ordeal. Chen had anticipated this possibility. He quickly disassembled his rifle, separating the stock from the barrel and action. As he did so, he began to chant in what sounded like Vietnamese, words his father had taught him decades earlier. The burned stock in his other hand began to glow with a faint light, and Morrison could see wisps of dark smoke rising from both rifle stocks. The curse was being drawn back to its original source, pulled away from Chen's weapon like iron filings drawn to a magnet. The Vietnamese gunsmith who created this curse also created the means to contain it, Chen explained as he continued his chant. "My father spent years learning the ritual from surviving members of her family. The spirit can be trapped, but it requires someone willing to make the ultimate sacrifice." Morrison understood immediately. "Someone has to carry the original stock to keep the curse contained." Chen nodded solemnly. "My family has been the guardians for 30 years. When my father died, the responsibility passed to me, and someday it will pass to my children." The dark smoke swirling around the stalks was growing thicker, and Morrison could hear faint sounds of anguish and rage coming from within the supernatural mist. The woman's voice that had whispered to him for so long was screaming now, furious at being denied its feast of death. As Chen completed the ritual, the smoke was drawn entirely into the burned stock, which sealed itself with what appeared to be bands of blackened metal. The cursed rifle stock in Morrison's hands crumbled to dust, leaving only ordinary wood and metal behind. Chen carefully wrapped the burned stock in a special cloth and placed it in his pack. "It's contained again, but not destroyed. The curse is too old and too powerful to be eliminated completely. The best we can do is keep it from claiming more victims." Morrison looked down at his rifle, now nothing more than a standard military weapon. He felt empty, drained of the supernatural confidence that had made him legendary, but also free of the terrible hunger that had been consuming his soul. "What happens now?" Morrison asked. "Now you go home," Chen replied. "Request a transfer, get some help dealing with what you've experienced, and try to rebuild your life. The rifle can't hurt you anymore, but the memories of what it made you feel will take time to heal." In the compound below, the meeting was breaking up, the insurgent leaders dispersing without ever knowing how close they had come to death. Morrison felt no regret about the missed opportunity. For the first time in months, the thought of killing held no appeal for him. As the two snipers prepared to leave their position, Chen turned to Morrison with a serious expression. "There's something you need to understand. This rifle isn't the only cursed weapon out there. The original gunsmith created others before she died, and they're still circulating somewhere in the world. If you ever encounter reports of snipers with impossible accuracy, or weapons that seem to have minds of their own, I'll contact you," Morrison promised. Chen handed him a business card with only a phone number printed on it. "Day or night. This curse has already claimed too many good Marines. We can't let it claim any more." As they made their way back toward base, Morrison felt the weight of his ordinary rifle on his shoulder. It was heavier now, but in a reassuring way that spoke of solid craftsmanship rather than supernatural malevolence. He was just a Marine again, with normal skills and human limitations. But he was alive, and his soul was his own. For now, that was enough. 6 months later, Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison stood in the office of Colonel Williams at Camp Pendleton, California. He had requested transfer back to the States immediately after the encounter with Chief Petty Officer Chen, and had spent the intervening time in counseling and rehabilitation. The nightmares had been the worst part. Not dreams about combat or violence, but memories of the supernatural confidence he had felt while under the rifle's influence. Sometimes he would wake up craving that feeling of power, that sense of being more than human. The counselors called it a form of addiction, and Morrison had to admit they were probably right. "Your psychological evaluation shows significant improvement," Colonel Williams said, reviewing Morrison's file. "The doctors say you've responded well to treatment for combat stress. Are you ready to return to active duty?" Morrison nodded. "Yes, sir. But I'd like to request assignment to a training position rather than operational deployment." The colonel looked surprised. "Morrison, your record shows you're one of the finest snipers in the Corps. Why would you want to step back from active operations?" Morrison had prepared for this question, but the real answer was too complex to explain to someone who hadn't experienced the curse firsthand. "I think I can do more good training the next generation of Marine snipers, sir." helping them develop not just their shooting skills, but their judgment and discipline. What Morrison didn't say was that his experience with the cursed rifle had taught him to recognize the warning signs of supernatural influence. As an instructor, he would be in a position to identify and help any Marine who might encounter similar threats. The colonel approved the assignment, and within 2 weeks Morrison was teaching advanced marksmanship at the Marine Corps Scout Sniper School. His students were impressed by his technical knowledge and his emphasis on the mental and spiritual aspects of long-range shooting. Accuracy isn't just about technique, Morrison would tell his classes. It's about maintaining control over yourself and your weapon. The moment you start to feel like the rifle is making decisions for you, that's when you need to step back and reassess. His fellow instructors thought Morrison was being overly philosophical, but his students appreciated the deeper perspective he brought to their training. Several of them would later credit Morrison's teaching with helping them make difficult ethical decisions in combat situations. 3 months into his new assignment, Morrison received a call that he had been expecting but hoping would never come. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but the code words were ones Chen had taught him. "This is Captain Rodriguez, Army Special Forces," the caller said. "I think we have a situation that requires your expertise." Morrison met Rodriguez at a secure facility in Nevada, where he was briefed on a disturbing pattern of incidents involving an Army sniper unit deployed to Syria. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had been achieving impossible accuracy rates, but her behavior had become increasingly erratic and violent. "She talks to her rifle," Rodriguez explained, showing Morrison surveillance footage from the unit's base, and other soldiers report hearing voices coming from the armory at night. Morrison studied the footage, watching Santos clean and maintain her weapon with the same loving care he remembered giving to the cursed M40A1. The signs were unmistakable. "How many confirmed kills?" Morrison asked. 47 in the past 2 months, Rodriguez replied. "All legitimate targets, but the frequency and circumstances are unusual." Morrison knew he had to act quickly. The longer Santos remained under the weapon's influence, the harder it would be to save her and contain the curse. He contacted Chen, who agreed to meet them in Syria within 72 hours. The mission to extract Santos and neutralize the new cursed rifle was more complex than Morrison's own rescue had been. Santos had become completely dominated by the weapon's influence and fought violently against any attempt to separate her from it. It took 3 specially trained soldiers to restrain her while Chen performed the containment ritual. When it was over, Santos was evacuated for medical treatment, and another cursed stock joined Chen's growing collection. Morrison realized that their work was far from finished. Somewhere in the world, more cursed weapons were waiting to claim new victims. Over the following years, Morrison became part of an unofficial network of military personnel who tracked and neutralized supernatural threats. He remained at the Scout Sniper School, but took frequent temporary assignments to investigate reports of impossible marksmanship and mysterious weapon behavior. The work was dangerous and often thankless, but Morrison had found his true calling. He had been chosen by the curse, survived its influence, and now dedicated his life to preventing others from suffering the same fate. Late at night, when he cleaned his current rifle in his quarters at Camp Pendleton, Morrison sometimes thought he could hear distant whispers calling to him, but they held no power over him now. He had learned to distinguish between the voice of his own conscience and the supernatural influences that sought to corrupt good Marines. The rifle stock, that had once borne the name Deathwind, was long since reduced to ash, but its lesson remained. Power without moral foundation was not strength but corruption, and the greatest victory was not the perfect shot, but the wisdom to know when not to pull the trigger. Morrison's students would carry that lesson with them to battlefields around the world, armed not just with superior marksmanship skills but with the spiritual discipline to resist any force that sought to turn them into instruments of indiscriminate death. The curse had been contained once again, but Morrison knew it would surface elsewhere, in different forms and different weapons. As long as humans waged war, there would be those willing to trade their souls for supernatural advantage. His job, and the job of others like Chen, was to stand ready to intervene when that dark bargain was offered. In the end, the greatest weapon against evil was not superior firepower, but the strength to choose humanity over power, mercy over vengeance, and wisdom over the seductive whisper of voices that promised easy victories at the cost of one's soul.